Hello and welcome to episode number 286. This is the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com, and I'm Cornelius Fichtner, and this, yes, is a premium episode, recorded and reserved for you, our premium subscribers. Thank you for your support. Migrating from using a waterfall-based approach to an agile approach for your projects is challenging, no doubt about it. Are there any best practices that you can follow in order to ease the migration pain? Well, Shawn says yes, there are. In fact, by the end of this interview, you will have heard a list of about 10 or so ideas, tips, best practices, and pitfalls to consider before, during, and after migrating from W to A. And of course, I opened the discussion by asking Shawn about the number one success factor that you need to consider for such a migration. So get your pencils ready and take notes. Enjoy the interview.
The Project Management Podcast's feature interview.
Today with Shawn Dickerson, Go-to-Market Director for @Task.
Hello, Shawn, and welcome back on the program.
Thank you. It's very good to be back. Appreciate it.
First things first, what would you say is the number one factor that makes going from waterfall-based project management approaches to Agile a success, and why?
I think the number one thing, which may not be intuitive, is realistic expectations. Because from our experience, it's usually not one or the other. It's usually not we're a completely agile shop or we're a completely waterfall shop. You know, there are certain elements, certain types of projects that lend themselves to a waterfall type methodology. You know, anything that's about producing a physical product, or maybe an audit or a compliance type effort, or even in the IT world, infrastructure projects, actually managing of servers. Those type of efforts lend themselves to a waterfall methodology. Whereas Agile works very well if we're talking about a software development effort or anything that's services related and repeatable in that sense. So really it's about, number one would be just be smart about where you start this effort. Don't be too rigid about either methodology, and realize that the reality is probably going to be a mixture of the two, just because most enterprises, even going through an agile transformation, have certain types of work that lend themselves to one or the other.
Why do companies want to make the shift to Agile in the first place? I mean, what's the promise of Agile?
Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, for those types of work that lend themselves to Agile, like software development, the promise is to deliver products faster and to deliver them more in line with customer requirements. Because rather than a process where all of the requirements are defined and locked down at the beginning of a project, it's very iterative. And every couple of weeks, you're reviewing with customer stakeholders what's been accomplished. Is it in line with the initial expectations? So ideally, you're delivering a product faster that the customer is more excited about. And it also gives you a little more flexibility, a lot more flexibility actually as requirements change, because I'm sure your audience is very familiar with project requirements that change throughout the course of a project. On the flip side, in an agile environment, it's also a lot easier to introduce scope creep and an expanding scope of features into a given project. So that can be a danger, but there's a lot of potential gains through an agile methodology.
And when you look at your customers that have done this migration, does the reality live up to the promise?
For many of them, it has, but the caution I would add that it's like anything else. An agile transformation depends on what you put into it. You know, if you consider a successful project, the elements of a successful project, you can think about executive sponsorship, engaged stakeholders, team members that are willing to participate and follow an established workflow or process. If those same elements are in place, Agile has a much better chance of being successful than if they're absent.
All right, let's look at some best practices in regards to doing the migration from Waterfall to Agile. What would you say are the high-level steps that should be followed as you do that Waterfall to Agile migration?
Well, I'll actually come at that a little bit of a different way. I'll talk about kind of the inverse of that, which is what are the common pitfalls that people run into that halts that transformation or that causes problems. Number one would be no training. So without any kind of training for a group that's trying to adopt the Agile methodology, that poses a lot of challenges. Sometimes a company or a group will decide, hey, we want to employ Agile in certain areas of the company, but they won't provide any instruction on how to assign stories or plan sprints or so forth. And the project leaders assigned to manage those teams are sometimes not trained on how to wrap iterations into an overall waterfall plan. So that's one, is that there's just the proper training isn't given about what Agile means and how it works. The second would be if there's simply no buy-in. Culture is a huge key to success in implementing an Agile strategy. But without management's buy-in, the team can be siloed, disconnected, forgotten, and, in some instances, we've seen just eventually disbanded. Managers are responsible for showcasing the value of their teams, and that means that getting that stakeholder buy-in is important, very important to an Agile transformation. And the last thing I would mention, particularly in the enterprise, it's different if you're, say, a software development company that all of your work processes are based on Agile. But for most enterprises, there's going to be a mixture of work methodologies. And that means that there has to be some type of translation between the two. For example, it's great if you've got an Agile development team that's being iterative and working in sprints and delivering pieces of a product every 2 weeks. But the executive team likely doesn't care about any of that. They want to know what's the delivery date and what does that final feature set look like. So it's important that there's some translation there between the Agile teams and the rest of the business. Those are three, and you can obviously consider the inverse of those as the way to approach it, but those are some common pitfalls that we see. Zero training, zero buy-in, and zero translation.
Do you have an example for us from one of your customers maybe where such a migration went well?
Yeah, actually, one, I can't mention the name, but one very large global organization has been really successful in what we call a mixed methodology environment. So a large group that is used to a traditional waterfall-based project management and work methodology has made the transition to Agile in a couple of their teams. One is an IT development team, and another is an actual translation department. They've been very successful at letting those teams operate in Agile, while at the same time keeping a number of other projects and their overall strategic plan in a waterfall flow. And I think one of the reasons that they've been really successful where others haven't is they were really willing to just let those Agile teams do what they needed to do, rather than trying to be overly prescriptive about how they should operate as an Agile team. They took a bit of a hands-off approach, let them know what they needed to accomplish, and let the team go to work.
Let me go back to the number one pitfall that you mentioned a moment ago. That was lack of training. How do we ensure that we don't forget to give our teams the training that they need before we migrate?
I think the key is communication. Reiterating the goals of the Agile approach, reiterating the process, reiterating the value that we think the effort will bring, that's what sort of brings to the forefront any gaps that might be there. That's one of the real principles of some flavors of Agile, is this sort of daily stand-up meeting where you're quickly communicating every day on progress. Where are we? How are we doing? You can't operate an effective Agile team using the same sort of principles that you would do with a more linear approach. There has to be constant communication. so that you have a steady pulse on where people are at, what are they working on, what are the gaps, where does additional training need to take place.
In the first interview that you and I did, we talked about the @Task software, and you mentioned then that it does support Agile, and it also has Waterfall methodologies in there. So let's see how it supports users when they want to migrate from Waterfall to Agile. So how can the software support me in that transition?
Great question. I think the approach that @Task takes is that we really embrace the reality of mixed methodologies. If a company is 100% agile, which is fairly rare, but if they're 100% agile, there are really other tools that they ought to be considering. However, if they're living in this world of mixed methodologies, which some research we did with GigaOM earlier in the year suggests that most enterprises are in that bucket, then @Task is a solution that can help them live in that mixed methodology world. In fact, later this year, we're releasing a new document called A Manager's Guide to Mixing Agile and Waterfall, which will talk about the principles involved in making the two of those work. As an example, a lot of companies may have a software development team, whether internal or externally facing, that operates in Agile. But that Agile development will often be part of a larger waterfall plan, say a new product launch, where there's a certain element of requirements gathering and vetting and later on testing and packaging and promotion and launch dates and launch events. A lot of those things make more sense, a larger, longer-term waterfall-based project plan, but there's certain elements of that work especially well in Agile. So @Task allows companies to mix those two methodologies in a very logical way so that each team gets to operate in the way that makes sense for them, but overall the company has good visibility across both work methodologies.
Have you found that a specific industry or maybe a specific type of project lends itself more to Agile than others?
When it comes to project types, definitely as we talked about in the beginning, software development is the most common place to find Agile methodologies. A lot of services efforts work very well in Agile. When it comes to industry, though, or I might even say department, we're seeing broad interest and adoption across the board. Obviously, tech is where a lot of this started based on software development, but it really runs the gamut now. We have marketing teams at media and entertainment companies that are running Agile. There's operational reporting groups, finance groups at large banks or financial services companies that are running in Agile. So even though it may have started in the tech world, this Agile iterative approach is making sense for a lot of different groups, a lot of organizations across the board.
How about simply using Agile on a pilot project in our organization and just, give it a try? Will that work? Can that work?
I would go even a step further. Not only will that work, I would say that's encouraged. As we talked about earlier, for most organizations, the reality is a mixture of different types of methodologies. And so that's really the paradigm that @Task embraces, is adopt Agile at your own pace. That an Agile transformation typically makes the most sense if you look at those teams that lend themselves, or the work style and the projects lend themselves to Agile, and go after those first. Make those the pilots, see how it works, work through some of those issues around training and language and metrics before you try to put a major stake in the ground around a certain methodology. Like anything, you want to have some quick wins and some data points to show the value of the effort before you try to make it a total organizational override. So I would say absolutely that's an ideal way to approach it.
As always, let's close our interview here with some of your recommendations that our listeners can apply in their own organizations and projects. And I'd like us to focus on the exploration of a possible migration from Waterfall to Agile. So that much said, can you give us your top 3 to 5 factors and considerations for our listeners that they should think about, that they should look into in order only to determine if a migration from Waterfall to Agile is something that they should even be attempting and considering.
Yes, great question. Here's the three things that I would suggest. Number one is take a look at the work that you're doing. Does it really fit an Agile model? For example, there was one IT director that we worked with who said, look, I want to do all of my corporate app dev work in Agile. That makes a lot of sense. But I'm never going to do my infrastructure projects in Agile. And when we're dealing with physical products like that and the installation of those items, it makes more sense to use a traditional waterfall approach. So the first thing is to take a look at the type of work that you're doing and whether it fits an Agile methodology, whether that iterative approach that's very flexible, but sometimes a little less definable. For example, with Agile, you don't always know what the end product is going to look like because what you can accomplish in terms of a feature set is defined by the amount of time you have. So if a little flexibility on what the end product looks like is not ideal, then Agile's probably not a really good approach to take. If, on the other hand, having a product or an end product that's maybe a little smaller in scope, but more targeted and more flexible because things weren't completely defined at the outset, that could be a good candidate for an Agile approach. So that's number one, is to take a look at the work that you're doing. The second would be to look at company culture. Does your company have an appetite for this iterative, flexible approach that is Agile? Because it requires a certain amount of letting go. It requires a little less definition, again, with the goals being faster delivery and more in line with company requirements. But if your company culture can't really support that based on the reporting requirements, the policies that are in place, that's another important factor to consider. And the third thing I would point to, the last thing I would point to, is the metrics, because you still have to show value. Regardless of the work methodology you use, you still have to get stuff done. And so if there's general agreement that some of the metrics that you would use in an Agile environment are sufficient to provide an effective status update, progress, to give executive stakeholders visibility into what the team is doing, then that could be a great candidate. But if you can't get agreement on those metrics, then you're probably setting yourself up for a very difficult road.
All right, to recap, if you're thinking about going from Waterfall to Agile, then look at the type of work you're doing and also think about product flexibility. Don't forget to look at your company culture and, of course, look at the metrics. And don't forget the 3 pitfalls that Shawn mentioned earlier, which are training, the missing buy-in, and that there needs to be a translation when you mix the methodologies. Fantastic tips. Shawn, thank you so much for coming on the program to us today and giving us all these tips.
My pleasure, and an excellent recap. So thanks very much for the time.
And that was Shawn Dickerson and our discussion on migration from Waterfall to Agile. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can find us on the web at pm-podcast.com. And if you are a PM who wants to become PMP or PMI ACP certified, then the easiest way to do so is with our 2 sister podcasts, the PM Prepcast and the Agile Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching the in-depth exam prep video training from pmprepcast.com and agileprepcast.com. Please send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com, and when you write, yes, you know this, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. And finally, we have this. An intelligent person, armed with a checklist, is no substitute for experience. Until next time. First things first, what would you say is the number one factor that makes going from water-based project water-based? I'm sorry.
No problem, as opposed to those carbon-based projects.
Oh, wonderful. Thank God we're editing these things out.